It's time to not only do a decade later of the Strokes, but to jump to the defense of the Strokes with their 2011 album Angles. From what I've seen, often this one is labelled as one of their weaker albums, and I get it. You know, their first two albums were so strong that I think anything after that could easily be considered weaker by comparison. But often when you look at these Strokes' discography and how people view their albums, it seems as though that their 2020 album, The New Abnormal, was considered a bit of a return to form, which I'm not totally against, although subscribing to that belief is doing a disservice to Angles, to be honest, because, I mean, in my opinion, this was better than The New Abnormal. And then in context with their discography, it doesn't really provide a huge amount of differentiation across the board. I mean, a lot of these tunes have the core elements of what you'd get from a Strokes song. It's just occasionally there's a bit of synth added in, you know, a bit of an 80s flavour to some of these tracks occasionally. But aside from that, there really doesn't seem to be a huge drop in quality or a huge change in sound or change of pace for what the Strokes have always done. The tracks are still super sticky as hell, they're hooky, they're catchy, they have killer bass lines and grooves across the entire album. It might be the highlight of the whole thing actually. The bass on this thing is really, really goddamn good. But yeah, in my opinion, this is a really good album. I mean, it's not perfect by any means. I'd still rank it below their first two releases if I was to ever do a ranked video. I guess I've kind of spoilt that one for you there, but nevertheless, I still would consider this an absolutely worthwhile release from the Strokes, with some of my favourite songs that they've ever done. The first two tracks particularly being up there with their best, in my opinion. The funky little groove on that first track, those verses, oh man, it's an impeccable little groove going on there. Absolutely love the dancey post-chorus little rhythm they've got going on with their It's such a classic chorus for the Strokes as well. It's so recognisable instantaneously. It is sticky, as all their choruses tend to be. And it's just got such a killer riff on this one, man. I love that guitar riff. It's so damn fun. And just reminds me of some like early 2000s, kind of like, I guess, dance punk bands. They would totally go for stuff like this. Thinking of someone maybe in the realms of like a Franz Ferdinand perhaps. Kind of like post-punk revivalist sort of stuff. Really had a great little run that era did. And this is just reminiscent of those kinds of bands for me. The Cover of Darkness, once again, has a great riff to it. They just always manage to give you memorable riffs. It's crazy actually, even on their most recent album there were tracks like The Adults Are Talking, which has a fantastic riff to it. So even when they're not exactly changing things up a huge amount, they're doing what they do best, and I've always liked that about the Strokes. This one though reminds me of like some Heartland rock type stuff, maybe some Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. It's just got that tone to it, maybe some Bruce Springsteen as well, with obviously the twist of it being a Strokes track. There's specific little things about each track that kind of separates itself from the previous track or the track in front of it. It's interesting how they've managed to do that on this album, and everything still remains pretty consistent and everything's really tight. The performances are tight. Julian's giving his usual kind of like muffly, sort of like slacker, laid back voice that he always does, but he sounds pretty great. That surely applies most to Two Kinds of Happiness, which has these really muffly and drowned out vocals on the verses, but then once you hit that chorus, man, they break free, and it's such a euphoric part of the track. It's one of the best choruses on the whole album for me, mostly because of that juxtaposition between those verses and then breaking free into that chorus. It's so damn good. And then little guitar licks on the chorus too totally remind me of something like Foles would do. It's kind of got that mathy sort of edge to it. Not to be mistaken with the fact that most of these choruses are really damn good as well. Taken for a Fool has such a catchy sing-along type chorus. I like the lyrics on this one as well. Games totally takes advantage of that synthness that's sort of lingering on some of these tracks throughout the album. It really shows up the most here though. It really just sounds like the Strokes wrote a song in the middle of the 1980s, to be honest. Like, it really sounds like they just transported themselves to that time period and wrote a song using what they had around them at that time, and you know, use the influences that were huge on music at that time. And it's cool to me how it doesn't sound like it's in, you know, an obvious throwback. It really just does sound like the band were writing a song from that era. It's pretty clever. Very similar to Metabolism, which sounds like a predecessor to what the Voids were doing. This really sounds like the sort of like the kind of like blueprint to what Julian wanted to do when he did the Void stuff, which obviously is quite a detour from what the Strokes were doing, but it obviously has that kind of like weird manic feel to it, with of course like the clashing strange synths throughout the track. It's really, really clever, and I think again, it showed that Julian had a different edge to him, a different vibe to him from what he could do with the Strokes, because it's way different to what the Voids do. And honestly, I like the Voids quite a lot, especially Tyranny. I think that's a pretty damn great album, honestly. Their second album was pretty good too, but still, I appreciate the way Julian is kind of like going across different sounds and styles and using different influences to make his music. They're not just sticking to one thing, and it started to show on this album more so than most of their other ones. As for negatives, I've gotta say Call Me Back is easily the worst track. This track is such a flaccid song. Like, it's so numbing listening to this. I don't know where it's attempting to take you. The pace of it is so ridiculously slow. It really is like sitting through a video that says buffering, and that thing's going round and round and round and round over and over again, and it's like you're watching and waiting for something to finally show up, and yet you're just stuck on an eternal buffer. It's such a weak moment for the album. I'm expecting something to build, or it to kind of like crescendo into something. It never really quite does. And honestly, if I were to ask any Strokes fan what the worst track on this album is, I could imagine a lot of people would say this one. Gratisfaction at least kind of brings things back to normality a little bit. I like the chorus on this one. It reminds me of something the Beatles would have done in their prime. You know, more of like their poppy sing-along type stuff. Definitely gets that edge to it. It's definitely gotten that edge to it. So yeah, I mean, I'm here to say and defend Angles. I think it's really good. I think it's a really, really fun little listen. Look, you don't have to compare it to their first two albums. Just as a standalone release, I enjoy this a lot. So you could make comparisons to every other album they've put out. Some bands get that treatment a little bit, I think. It's always like, oh, I wanted it to be like these ones. And then other bands don't get that treatment. It's interesting how it works. But look, the Strokes, even well beyond 10 years into their career, were still dropping really good albums, and Angles is an example of that. As you can tell, I do like this one a lot, and I'm glad I took the time out to give it a decade later treatment, because it might give you guys a different perspective, or even a different angle. Different angle. Maybe you guys weren't that big on it before. Maybe you were lukewarm on it, and now you might go back to it and view it with a different lens, or you might really like it anyway, and I'm just telling you something you already know. Yeah. So do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Would love to hear what you guys think of this one. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Tell me what I should do next in this series of a decade later. There's plenty of 2011 releases that I already plan on doing, but you might have a different one that I should look at, and that'd be great. So thank you. Do have a good day. Subscribe if you have not already. And goodbye. Yeah.